In today's video, we're uncovering 5 terrifying true stories of people who ventured into the forest and encountered things that shook them to the core. From eerie whispers in the trees to things that stalk in the shadows, these stories will make you think twice before stepping off the beaten path. So, grab a drink, settle in, and if you're ready, let's begin. I worked in national parks and also did some volunteer search and rescue. One snowy night, we received word that a woman had gone missing from a group staying in a cluster of scenic cabins nearby. It took us about 2 hours to reach the cabins and interview the people there. The snow had turned the area into a ghostly, white landscape, with the wind howling through the trees and the temperature plummeting. The cabins, typically cozy and inviting, now looked like dark, ominous structures huddled together against the storm. We met with the group who had reported the missing woman. Their faces were pale and drawn, their voices strained with worry. They told us that the woman, Sarah, had gone out for a walk and never returned. She was last seen heading into the woods, her path quickly covered by the snow. They explained that she had seemed unusually distressed before leaving and saying she's got to get to her car. As we set out to search, the storm made everything more difficult. Visibility was minimal, and the snow seemed to absorb sound, creating an eerie silence. Each crunch of our boots felt unnaturally loud, a constant reminder of our isolation. There was something odd in this part of the woods. I knew we were alone in this remote area, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just the swirling snow and dark trees. My colleagues seemed equally uneasy, their faces taut with concentration and apprehension. We spread out to cover more ground, but the sense of unease never left. Every now and then I would hear faint, unidentifiable noises, footsteps perhaps, but too irregular to pinpoint. My heart raced each time I thought we might be nearing our goal, but each time the sounds turned out to be nothing more than the shifting of snow or the creaking of branches. After several hours of searching, we came across a small clearing that seemed oddly calm amidst the storm. The snow had settled here, creating a stark contrast with the swirling chaos of the woods around it. In the center of the clearing was a figure. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As I drew nearer, I noticed something chilling. The woman's posture was unnervingly still, almost unnatural. When we finally reached her, I saw her face. Sarah's eyes were wide and vacant, her expression frozen in a look of terror. Her clothes were disheveled, and her hair was matted with snow and ice. But it was her eyes that struck me the most. They were hollow, devoid of the spark of sanity. Her gaze seemed to see right through us, as if we were mere shadows in her world. Her mouth opened, but no coherent words came out. Only a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Despite our efforts to communicate, it was clear that Sarah was no longer fully aware of her surroundings. Her mind had shattered in the face of whatever she had encountered in those woods. The search team worked quickly to get her back to the cabins, but the whole experience left an indelible mark on me. I don't know what Sarah saw out there, or what drove her to the brink of madness. But I do know one thing. Some places are best left undisturbed, and the woods that night were among them. I was talking to an old fella who used to trap wildlife in New Zealand in the 80s. He said he would occasionally come across fully fenced-off areas with barbed wire in the middle of nowhere. Most of the time, he'd just back away, thinking no one would fence off a remote area if they wanted visitors. But one time, he heard noises of distress coming from inside the fence, so he decided to investigate. As he approached the fence, he noticed the air was unusually still, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muffled. The distressing noises he heard were faint but persistent, a series of high-pitched cries and rustling that made his skin crawl. He hesitated, then climbed over the barbed wire, carefully avoiding the sharp edges. Inside the fenced area, the forest was unnaturally quiet. The trees were thick and close together, casting dark shadows even in the daylight. He followed the sounds, moving cautiously through the dense underbrush. The noises grew louder and more frantic as he pressed on. Eventually, he stumbled upon a small clearing where the source of the distressing sounds became clear. In the middle of the clearing was a pit, crudely dug and lined with old, rotting timber. The cries were coming from the pit, desperate, pitiful sounds that seemed to come from something trapped and suffering. Peering over the edge, he was horrified to see a collection of animals, some injured, some barely alive, scrambling around in the darkness of the pit. They were clearly abandoned and left to fend for themselves, and the stench of decay and fear was overpowering. He quickly realized that this was no ordinary trapping site. There was something deeply unsettling about the entire setup. The idea that someone would deliberately trap and abandon animals like this was deeply disturbing. He felt a shiver run down his spine as he wondered who could be responsible for such cruelty. Fearing for his own safety and overwhelmed by the grim sight before him, he decided to leave. He scrambled out of the fenced area and made his way back through the forest, not looking back. The cries of the trapped animals haunted him for weeks afterward. He never reported what he saw to anyone. To this day, he still wonders what kind of person or people could be behind such a horrifying act. I wonder too. Was there more to the fenced-off area than he ever knew? He told me he never went back to find out. As he told me this story, I couldn't help but feel a chill. The thought of what might be hidden behind those fences, or what might have happened to those animals, lingered in my mind. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the most unsettling things are those that remain hidden, waiting in the shadows of our darkest fears. Forests have always been a backdrop for unsettling stories, thanks to their mysterious and isolating nature. Their dense trees and darkness can turn a simple walk into a nerve-wracking experience. This was something I learned the hard way when I was 17. It was a chilly autumn evening, and my friends, Mark and Jake, wanted to get high in the woods. I wasn't interested, but I agreed to drive them and wait in the car. We parked at the edge of a dense forest. I watched as Mark and Jake disappeared down a path, their laughter fading into the darkness. I waited in the car, trying to find something to pass the time. But with nothing to do and boredom creeping in, I decided to go find them. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the forest, choosing the largest of 4 paths. The darkness was thick, and without a flashlight, I relied on the faint glow of the moon. I walked for a few minutes, the sounds of the forest unnerving me with each step. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Eventually, I came across a dip in the trail. On the other side, I saw a bench faintly illuminated by the moonlight. There were 2 figures near the bench, one sitting, the other standing. From where I stood, they looked like Mark and Jake. I called out to them, but something was off. The figures turned to face me, but they didn't respond. They just stared. My heart began to race. I couldn't make out any details, just 2 dark silhouettes against the faint glow of the bench. We stood frozen in place for a moment. Then suddenly, the figure sitting on the bench stood up and sprinted towards me at full speed. Panic seized me. The man moved with a terrifying silence, his footsteps making no sound as he closed the distance between us. I turned and ran, the forest a blur around me. I stumbled and tripped over roots and rocks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting away. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the forest and into the clearing where my car was parked. I dove for the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I sat there, chest heaving, eyes darting around the darkness outside, expecting to see that figure come rushing out of the trees. But nothing happened. The woods were still and silent. My mind raced with thoughts of Mark and Jake. Where were they? What if they ran into them? Just as I was about to go back out there, I saw movement. My heart leapt into my throat, but it was just Mark and Jake, emerging from a different path on the other side of the clearing. They said they heard the commotion and sprinted towards the car to see what was going on. As we left the woods behind, I couldn't shake the image of that figure sprinting toward me, silent and fast. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back to those woods again. Years ago, I remember sneaking out of my friend's house at night to do nothing but walk around the neighborhood and hide from car headlights. We were young and bored. There was a homeless camp down in some woods off the railroad tracks, not too far from his house. We had seen the trail and knew what was back there. One of the homeless guys who lived there was actually an old friend of my buddy's dad. He had stopped over a few times, and my friend's dad let him shower there and everything. He could have worked if he wanted, but he had told us he just liked living off the grid. We were a bit nervous at first, thinking, what if we get there and his dad's friend isn't there? So we were sneaking up on it. It was a longer walk than we thought. We got kind of close and saw that there was a fire going, lighting up the woods a bit. We started sneaking closer, but the trail seemed to continue straight, while the camp was set off to the left. We got, I don't know, maybe 100 feet from the camp, about 30 meters, and we looked down the trail and saw a faint silhouette of what we thought was a person. The silhouette looked like it was coming from deeper in the woods towards the camp. We froze and ducked slightly to the side of the trail. I told my friend that I didn't like it and that we should just sneak the hell out. He said he had the same feeling. As I said, the fire at the camp was just enough to light the area well enough to see. We ended up slowly creeping slightly off the trail back to the railroad tracks. We got probably 30 or 40 feet, and I told him I would rather just hit the trail and slowly walk back, because the bushes, trees, and everything were hard to navigate. I wanted to be able to see something coming, so we could book it out. We played football and were both pretty fast. We slid out of the brush and saw that the silhouette had gotten closer. However, moving further from the fire, the light was dimmer, but we could still make out that someone or something was standing there, moving closer. My first thought was that maybe they saw us duck into the bushes and were coming to check, but it just felt off. My friend and I looked at each other and both mutually and silently decided to pick up the pace. Almost on cue, we both looked back, and the silhouette was now booking it towards us. Absolutely silent. No noise, just fast movement. We hightailed it as fast as we could. Thankfully, the trail was wide, so we weren't bumping into each other or anything. Neither of us looked back until we hit the railroad tracks, then crossed the railroad track bridge and were on the other side. I looked back as I was slowing down, past the bridge, and I saw a silhouette creeping toward us. Even though it was still too dark to see any details, the sight of that figure sent a chill down my spine. My friend and I didn't say a word as we hurried back to his house, our footsteps quickening with each glance over our shoulders. The adrenaline from our close call kept us moving until we were safely inside. We both knew how lucky we were that night. Nothing bad had happened, but it easily could have. That brush with danger taught me a valuable lesson. I was done taking unnecessary risks. From that point on, I promised myself I'd stay out of places I didn't belong. I never went back to those woods, and I never will. On New Year's Day in 2008, I decided to start the year off with a hike. Living in Georgia, I chose to climb Blood Mountain, a popular trail with stunning views. After a challenging ascent, I reached the summit and enjoyed the crisp, cool air. However, my day took a disconcerting turn when I encountered an older man who made my creep radar go haywire. Something about him was distinctly unsettling. He had an unsettlingly calm demeanor, but there was an edge to his presence that I couldn't quite place. His clothing was worn and shabby, as if he had been in the woods for days. What really set me on edge was the way he looked at me. His eyes seemed to linger too long, and his gaze was unnervingly intense. He approached me and asked if anyone was in the shelter, or if I had seen many people on the trail. His questions were oddly specific, and there was a sense of urgency in his voice that felt out of place. I was taken aback by his directness and the peculiar way he studied my responses. I fumbled through my answers, trying to stay polite, but clearly wanting to end the conversation. Every instinct in me screamed to get away, so I cut the exchange short and quickly left the area. I made it home without incident, but the encounter left me feeling deeply unsettled. A few days later, the news broke about the tragic murder of Meredith Emerson. Meredith, a 24-year-old hiker, had been abducted and killed by Gary Hilton, a notorious serial killer known for preying on hikers in the region. The details of her abduction were horrifying and gruesome. As I followed the news, the eerie connection to my own experience became impossible to ignore. Hilton had been active in the same area, and it dawned on me that he might have been in the vicinity during my hike. The thought that the man I had encountered could have been someone with nefarious intentions, or even a potential accomplice, was deeply disturbing. The way that man had questioned me, his unsettling calmness, and the peculiar intensity of his gaze replayed in my mind with chilling clarity. The realization that I had been in such close proximity to a potential predator was unsettling beyond words. It was a stark reminder of how dangerous situations can sometimes hide behind a facade of normalcy, and how easily a seemingly innocent encounter can take on a sinister light when viewed through the lens of tragedy. The whole experience made me acutely aware of the hidden dangers that can lurk even in familiar and supposedly safe places. Well, those were 5 chilling tales from the forest. Which one creeped you out the most? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the stories, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And as always, stay safe out there. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows.